Get your free copy of the complete tutorial at www.teachucomp.com/free.
You can use the pivot table feature of Excel to access some of the most powerful data analysis that Excel can provide. Pivot tables allow you to organize massive amounts of data in more coherent and meaningful ways to extract from the data exactly what you need to know. Probably the most helpful feature of pivot tables is the ability that they have to be reorganized quickly and easily to change what information they're displaying and calculating. When you create a pivot table, you are comparing information in your spreadsheet and then calculating intersecting values of your choosing. In addition to the pivot tables, you can also run pivot table reports that allow you to easily compare data within the pivot table in a more report-like format. This can make printing and displaying the data that you want to define by using the pivot table a bit more easy. You can also create pivot charts, which use the data from pivot tables but display it in a more graphic format. If you're using Excel 97, unfortunately, you will not have pivot charts available for use as they hadn't been created yet. The best way to learn how to use pivot tables is to actually create one with which you can experiment and practice. Excel makes it easy to create a pivot table from your data. So to create a pivot table, just select the spreadsheet that contains the data from which you would like to create a pivot table. Next, select Data from the menu bar and choose Pivot Table and Pivot Chart Report. If you're using Excel 97, it'll instead be Data and just plain old Pivot Table from the menu bar. This launches the Pivot Table and Pivot Chart Wizard dialog box. Here you must answer questions posed to you on each screen in the wizard. When you are finished on a screen, you can click Next to go to the next screen. If you need to change your mind, you can click Back at the bottom of the dialog box to move backwards to the previous screen. And the goal is to progress through all the screens until you're finished, at which point you can click the Finish button to close the wizard and create your pivot table. So let's take a look at what will be asked on each screen in the wizard, and also examine what options are available to us to create our pivot table. In Step 1 of the Pivot Table and Pivot Chart Wizard, you have to select the source of data for the pivot table. Your choices are Microsoft Excel list or database, which pulls the data from your Excel spreadsheet, an external data source, which allows you to use data from a query or an open database connection. You could also choose multiple consolidation ranges, which sets the data to be pulled from multiple ranges in one or more worksheets. Or you could choose another pivot table report or pivot chart report, which actually pulls data from another pivot chart or pivot table that you have available in the workbook. Once you've made your selection, below that, starting in Excel 2000, you're asked what kind of report you want to create. You can choose either pivot table or pivot chart report with pivot table report. And once you've made your choice in this screen, click Next to proceed to screen 2. In Step 2 of the Pivot Table and Pivot Chart Wizard, you must select the data source to use for the pivot table or pivot chart. Depending on what you selected as your data source in the first screen, the way that you select your source here can vary in a few ways. If you selected the Microsoft Office Excel list or database choice, then you have to use the Collapse Expand dialog box button at the right end of the Range text box to collapse the dialog box down to a single line. Then you can click and drag over the data that you would want to use as the source for the pivot table, unless of course it's already selected, as it is in this example. Once you've made your choice, click Next to continue. In Step 3 of the wizard, you have to select whether you want to place the pivot table or pivot chart into a new worksheet or into an existing worksheet. If you click the existing worksheet choice, then you'll have to click into the worksheet that you want to use and select the cell that you'd like as the upper left corner of the pivot table or pivot chart. When you're finished, just click Finish to create your new pivot table or pivot chart. Also note that in the screen shown for Step 3 of the Pivot Table and Pivot Chart Wizard, there's two buttons located in the lower left corner, Layout and Options. You can click the Layout button to show the older pivot table construction window in a separate dialog box. This dialog box is actually a part of the normal process of creating a pivot table in the older Excel 97 wizard, and it's also available in the 2000 and XP versions. However, now this feature is provided directly within the spreadsheet in the pivot table itself. You can also click the Options button to launch the Pivot Table Options dialog box. In here you can set various attributes of the pivot table, such as if you would like a grand total for rows or columns, or would you like an auto format applied. You can access it here as you're creating it, or you can access it later through the Pivot Table toolbar. So once you've completed the wizard, or the layout view if you're using Excel 97, then you'll see the actual structure of your pivot table along with the accompanying rows and columns of information from your data source. Now all you have to do is click and drag the fields from the pivot table field list and drop them into either the row, column, data items, or page areas in the spreadsheet. Fields that are placed into the data section are calculated with the sum function by default. So for example, if I threw in January, here I'm getting the sum of all the sales for January. You can rearrange the fields as needed, removing fields from the pivot table and changing the functions performed in the data section to create a pivot table that shows the information that you need in the layout that you prefer. So now we're seeing for each region sales by salespeople for January.
Like what you see? Pick up your free copy of the complete tutorial at www.teachucomp.com/free.